Racist cop used stun gun on black man, not knowing he is presidential advisor. It was a bright morning when Marcus Coleman stepped out of the large government building where he had spent hours in deep discussion with senior officials. As one of the president's most trusted advisors, his work was always heavy with responsibility, but he carried it with calmness and dignity. That day had been no different. Inside the building, he had spoken about new programs to help the country move forward. Outside, the world felt ordinary, filled with people walking, buses passing by, and street vendors calling out to customers. Marcus walked along the sidewalk with his usual steady pace, his leather briefcase in hand, his mind still half occupied with the weight of national matters. Marcus was a tall man with a warm but firm presence. His suit was neatly pressed, his shoes polished, and every movement carried the confidence of someone who knew where he was going. Yet beneath all of that, Marcus remained humble. He came from a small town, raised by hard-working parents who had taught him the importance of respect and fairness. No matter how high his position had risen, he never forgot where he came from. Perhaps that was why he never minded walking on the street instead of always riding in official cars. He liked to see people, hear them, and stay connected to real life outside of government halls. On that particular street, however, not everyone saw Marcus for who he truly was. A young police officer stood across the road, watching people pass by. The officer was new on the force, eager to prove himself, but also carrying quiet assumptions about people he judged too quickly. When his eyes landed on Marcus, something inside him narrowed. He saw not the advisor's confidence, but a figure he decided looked suspicious. Marcus's focused walk, his serious face, the briefcase in his hand, these ordinary things were, in the officer's mind, something unusual. Instead of pausing to think, instead of stepping forward to ask a simple question, the officer's hand moved toward his belt. Marcus had no idea he was being watched so closely. He thought only of the meeting he was about to attend later that day, the notes he had prepared, and the speech he would give at an upcoming forum. His mind wandered between his responsibilities and the thought of calling his daughter in the evening to ask about her school project. In his world, life was balanced between service to the country and love for his family. He was still thinking of these things when the sharp crackle of a stun gun filled the air. In a flash, Marcus felt a wave of electricity course through his body. The shock was sudden, unexpected, and deeply painful. His legs buckled, his briefcase slipped from his grasp, and he fell hard onto the pavement. The world blurred around him, sounds of gasps and cries from bystanders rising above the busy street noise. He could not understand what had just happened. His heart pounded, his chest tightened, and his body shook uncontrollably as the stun gun's charge pulsed through him. The officer stood rigid, holding the weapon in disbelief at what he had done. He had acted fast, too fast, without words or warning. People nearby began shouting, some rushing to Marcus's side, others holding up phones to record what was unfolding. A woman cried out, "Why did you do that?" He wasn't doing anything. A man bent to help Marcus, but the officer held out his hand as if to stop him, his face showing a mix of fear and confusion. The young officer had not expected this reaction, nor had he expected the man on the ground to carry such quiet strength even in pain. Marcus, though trembling and struggling to breathe normally, tried to lift his head. His voice, weak but steady, escaped his lips. Why would you do this?" His words were not angry, but full of genuine hurt and disbelief. His mind could not grasp how a simple walk on the street had turned into a public humiliation, his body aching from the sting of unwarranted force. He wanted to stand, but his muscles refused to obey. The crowd grew larger, whispers turning into louder voices. "He didn't do anything wrong. That's not how you treat people. Somebody call for help." The weight of many eyes pressed on the young officer, but pride and fear made him cling to his action. He moved toward Marcus, perhaps to justify himself, perhaps to control the scene, but his own hands shook. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind about what he had just done. Moments later, another man hurried into the crowd, his suit jacket open, his face pale with shock. He had been walking behind Marcus from the same government building and knew instantly what had happened. Rushing forward, he shouted, "That's Marcus Coleman. He works with the president." The words cut through the noise like a sharp blade. The crowd gasped, the officer froze, and Marcus, still trying to gather his strength, closed his eyes in silent sorrow. He had wanted to walk among people like anyone else, but now his very identity had to be spoken aloud just to defend his dignity. The officer's face turned red. He stepped back, looking at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. You're with the president," he stammered. The briefcase on the ground, now open from the fall, had papers inside with official seals. There was no mistaking it. The man he had just stunned in public was no stranger, no unknown figure, but a person at the heart of the nation's leadership. Marcus slowly sat up with help from the man who had rushed to his side. His chest still rose and fell heavily, his hands unsteady, but his voice carried calm authority. "Yes," he said quietly, locking eyes with the officer. "I advise the president." The words were not shouted, not meant to wound, but they carried a heavy disappointment that no one around could miss. It was not just the officer who felt the weight of those words, it was everyone standing there, watching the scene unfold. In that moment, the air grew thick with silence. The officer, struggling with his own choices, lowered his eyes. The people around Marcus shifted, some kneeling to comfort him, others holding their phones higher to capture the truth. A boy tugged at his mother's hand, whispering, "Why did they hurt him, Mom? He didn't do anything." The mother shook her head, unable to answer. Marcus, though still weak, found the strength to stand with help. He picked up his briefcase slowly, brushing off the dust, his eyes still calm but heavy with pain. He did not raise his voice, did not lash out. Instead, he said in a firm, steady tone, "I came here to serve this country. I never expected to be treated this way in the very streets I serve." His words carried the sorrow of the moment but also the quiet power of truth. Every ear that heard him knew this was more than just a single mistake. It was part of something deeper, something that touched not just one man, but many. The officer took a step back, realizing the gravity of his actions. The weight of shame settled on him, but it was too late. The scene had been witnessed, recorded, and remembered. Marcus, standing tall once again despite the pain in his body, adjusted his suit and straightened his shoulders. He would not let this moment break him. He carried himself with the same dignity he had always carried, even now when the world had tried to strip it from him. The people around him looked at him not just as a presidential advisor, but as a man who had endured injustice with grace. And though part one of his story ended in pain and shock, it also revealed the quiet strength of a man who knew who he was, even when others refused to see it. The street was no longer ordinary. What had started as a simple walk had turned into a scene filled with tension and disbelief. Marcus stood with help, still feeling the ache in his muscles from the sudden jolt of the stun gun. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths, and his hands trembled slightly though he tried hard to hide it. Around him, the voices of bystanders grew louder. Some spoke in anger at what had happened, while others whispered in shock, almost unable to believe what they had just seen with their own eyes. The officer who had fired the stun gun stood a few feet away, frozen in place. His hand, which had moments ago gripped the weapon with firmness, now hung at his side as if it no longer belonged to him. His young face was pale, his lips pressed tight as he struggled to process what he had done. He had acted quickly, without asking a single question, without a word of caution, and now the truth of his mistake was sinking in like a stone thrown into still water. Each ripple carried more weight than the last. A second police car arrived within minutes, its siren cutting through the uneasy silence. Two officers stepped out, both older and more experienced. They looked around at the gathered crowd, at Marcus still trying to steady himself, and at their fellow officer standing stiffly in guilt. One of them bent down to check on Marcus, speaking gently, "Sir, are you all right? Do you need an ambulance?" His voice carried a mix of concern and unease. He had recognized something the moment he saw Marcus's identification in the open briefcase. The name was familiar, too familiar, to be ignored. Marcus shook his head slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll be fine," he said, though his body still ached from the shock. "What I need is an explanation." The words were calm, but they carried weight, and everyone who heard them felt their strength. The man who had rushed in earlier, Marcus's colleague from the government building, stepped forward. His face was red with both anger and worry. "Do you understand what you've just done?" he said sharply to the young officer. "This man is Marcus Coleman, senior advisor to the President of the United States. He is not a threat. He is one of the most trusted figures in this nation." His words came like hammer blows, each one making the young officer shrink smaller. Gasps rose from the crowd again, this time louder. People looked at Marcus with new eyes, realizing the man they had just seen stunned in the middle of the street was no ordinary person. Some began to murmur to each other, "Did he say presidential advisor? Is that really him? I saw him on television once." The truth spread quickly through the bystanders, and with it came a wave of indignation. If such a respected man could be treated this way, what did that say about how ordinary people were treated every day? The older officer, sensing the danger of the situation, quickly approached the younger one. "What were you thinking?" he whispered harshly. "You didn't even ask him who he was." The young officer tried to speak, his lips moving soundlessly at first, then finally stammering, He looked suspicious. I thought he might." His voice faded as he realized how empty his words sounded in the face of the truth. Marcus's colleague placed a steadying hand on Marcus's shoulder, supporting him as he took another slow breath. Marcus looked at the officer who had stunned him, his eyes steady but full of disappointment. "You saw my skin before you saw me," he said softly. "You judged before you asked." The words were not shouted, not meant to humiliate, but they carried the weight of truth. And sometimes truth, spoken quietly, can pierce deeper than any angry shout. The officer lowered his head, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. His chest rose and fell with nervous breaths, his mind racing with the realization that his career, and perhaps more, might crumble because of one thoughtless action. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of someone in the crowd calling out, "This is wrong. He deserves respect." Others nodded, their voices rising in agreement. "That's right. He did nothing wrong. You can't treat people like this." The scene had transformed into more than a single confrontation. It had become a mirror of something larger, something that touched everyone present. Another car pulled up, this time a black government vehicle. Two men in dark suits stepped out quickly, their earpieces visible, their eyes scanning the crowd with practiced precision. They moved toward Marcus with urgency, their steps fast but controlled. "Mr. Coleman," one of them said, his voice firm yet respectful, "are you all right? We came as soon as we heard." Marcus nodded faintly, still leaning on his colleague for balance. "I'll manage," he replied, his voice calm even in the storm. His presence, though shaken, carried the same dignity it always had. The men in suits turned sharply toward the officers, their eyes narrowing. One of them spoke in a tone that brooked no argument. "Do you realize who this man is? Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" His words cut like steel, and the younger officer felt them strike deep. The older officer quickly tried to explain, stumbling over his words. "It was a misunderstanding. We'll handle this internally." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Their voices rose louder, fueled by the sight of injustice. Phones were lifted higher, recording every moment. The young officer's face appeared on countless screens as people streamed the scene live, their captions filling with outrage and disbelief. Marcus, despite his pain, lifted his hand slightly to quiet the noise. His voice, though softer than usual, carried clearly. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about how quickly we choose suspicion over understanding. How often we forget to see the person before us. Today, I was recognized because of my title. But what if I were just an ordinary man?" His words struck the crowd like a wave, settling over them in silence. Everyone understood what he meant. The young officer swallowed hard, his hands now shaking as much as Marcus's had earlier. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to undo what he had done, but the weight of the moment kept his mouth closed. His pride and fear clashed within him, leaving him rooted in shame. As the government agents helped Marcus toward their car, his colleague walking close behind, the cameras followed. The scene was no longer just an incident, it was becoming a story that would spread far beyond that street. The officer stood where he was, the noise of the crowd ringing in his ears, realizing that his single choice had ignited something much larger than himself. And as Marcus sank gently into the back seat of the car, his body still aching but his spirit unbroken, he knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a storm that would soon sweep across the city, the media, and perhaps even the nation itself. The news traveled faster than anyone could have imagined. By the time Marcus reached his office that afternoon, videos of the incident were already circling the internet. People had uploaded clips from every angle, and within minutes hashtags were trending. Screens lit up with his name, and headlines flashed bold letters: "Presidential advisor shocked by officer in broad daylight." The nation that usually only saw Marcus in carefully prepared speeches or official meetings now saw him lying on the pavement, his suit rumpled, his body trembling from the stun gun's charge. Inside his office, Marcus sat at his desk with a glass of water in hand, his body still weak but his mind sharper than ever. His staff moved quietly around him, answering non-stop calls, checking news updates, and trying to control the storm that was only getting bigger. He didn't say much at first. He just stared at the screen in front of him, watching the scene replayed over and over. Each time he saw it, he felt a strange mix of pain and resolve. It wasn't about his dignity anymore. It was about what this meant for the country. In households across the nation, families sat together watching the footage. Some watched in silence, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others shouted at the television, angry at the injustice of it all. "That's the president's advisor," a man exclaimed to his wife, pointing at the screen. "If that can happen to him, imagine what happens to people with no power, no name." His wife nodded slowly, her eyes wet with tears. In schools, teachers paused their lessons to talk about what had happened. Some students raised their hands and asked, "Why would the officer do that?" Teachers searched for careful words, knowing this was more than a single mistake. It was a chance to talk about respect, about fairness, about how quick judgments could change someone's life in a matter of seconds. The police department, overwhelmed by the growing storm, held a press conference that evening. The chief stood at a podium, his face grave. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, and the nation listened. "We are aware of the incident involving one of our officers and Mr. Marcus Coleman," the chief said. "An internal investigation has been launched. The officer involved has been placed on administrative leave pending review." His words were careful, practiced, but they did little to calm the anger outside. Protests began the very next day. Crowds gathered outside City Hall, holding signs and chanting for justice. Some signs read, "See the person, not the prejudice," and "Justice for Marcus, justice for all." The voices were loud but peaceful, echoing through the streets with determination. Marcus watched the protests from his office window later that week, feeling both gratitude and sadness. Gratitude that people stood with him, sadness that it had to come to this. The media storm grew even larger when talk shows and news panels invited experts to discuss the issue. Former police officers, civil rights leaders, professors, and ordinary citizens debated on screen. "This isn't just about one advisor," one commentator said firmly. "This is about a system that allows judgment to replace truth, assumption to replace respect." Another guest nodded and added, "If someone like Marcus Coleman can be treated this way in broad daylight, what message does that send to every other citizen?" Marcus's phone rang constantly. Messages poured in from government leaders, community members, and friends from his past. Some called to offer support, others to express outrage, and still others to ask him what he planned to do next. He listened quietly, speaking little, saving his words for when they would matter most. He knew the spotlight was now on him, and whatever he chose to say or do would carry weight far beyond his own experience. The president himself called late in the evening. "Marcus," the familiar voice said gently, "I saw what happened. I am deeply sorry. You know how much I trust you, how much this country needs your wisdom. Whatever you choose to do in response, you have my full support." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. It was comforting, but it also reminded him of the responsibility he carried not just as an advisor to the president, but as a man whose pain had now become a symbol for many others. Meanwhile, the young officer who had fired the stun gun sat alone at home, his badge on the table before him. His phone buzzed with messages, some from colleagues checking in, others from strangers sending sharp words. He scrolled through social media, seeing his own face in countless clips and articles. His name was not officially released, but people had already discovered it. He rubbed his temples, realizing his life had changed forever. What had been a single moment of poor judgment was now a national scandal. As the week went on, protests grew larger. More people gathered with signs, more chants filled the air, and more voices joined the call for change. Community leaders stood on stages, microphones in hand, telling the story of Marcus but also reminding everyone of the countless unnamed people who had faced the same treatment. "Marcus's name is known because of his title," one leader said passionately. "But how many others go unseen? How many others have no one to defend them when they fall?" The crowd roared in agreement, their voices united in a single demand: fairness. Marcus finally agreed to speak publicly. He stood before a row of cameras, his posture steady though his body still carried the memory of pain. He wore a dark suit, his tie neatly in place, his expression calm yet firm. The world watched as he began. "What happened to me was wrong," he said plainly. "But I am not here to speak only about myself. I am here to speak for everyone who has been judged too quickly, treated unfairly, or silenced because someone refused to see them as a person first. My title protected me after the fact. But what about those without a title? What about those without power or recognition?" His words flowed like water, clear, calm, but impossible to ignore. The room was silent as he spoke. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras rolled, and people across the nation listened from their living rooms, workplaces, and cars. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply told the truth in a way that touched hearts and minds. "We must do better," he concluded. "Not just for me, but for every citizen who deserves respect. Change cannot wait. Change must begin now." The crowd outside the building erupted into cheers. People wiped tears from their eyes, others raised their fists in silent solidarity. Marcus stepped back from the podium, his face calm, his eyes steady. He had spoken not just as an advisor, but as a man determined to turn pain into purpose. And so, part 3 of his story closed not with silence, but with noise, the noise of voices rising together, the noise of protests demanding reform, the noise of a nation waking up to its reflection. The storm that had begun with a single spark was now sweeping across the country, and Marcus stood at its center, ready to face what came next. The weeks that followed were heavy with tension. The video of Marcus being stunned had spread to every corner of the country, and now the world was watching to see what would happen next. The police department, under immense pressure, moved forward with its investigation. Every detail of the incident was reviewed, statements from witnesses, footage from bystanders' phones, even body camera recordings. Each piece of evidence told the same story: Marcus had done nothing wrong, yet he had been treated like a threat. The young officer who fired the stun gun was summoned for questioning. He sat in a small room across from investigators, his hands clasped tightly together. His voice wavered as he tried to explain himself. I thought he might be dangerous," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. The investigators listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions, but their expressions remained stern. It was clear to everyone that the officer had acted without cause, guided not by evidence but by assumption. Meanwhile, the community waited anxiously for the results. Protests continued, peaceful but firm, filling city streets with chants for justice. Families carried signs, students wore T-shirts with Marcus's name, and churches held gatherings where people prayed for fairness and healing. The movement was no longer about one man, it had become about the countless others who had faced similar treatment but never had their stories told. Inside his home, Marcus spent long nights reflecting. The sting of the stun gun had faded from his body, but the memory still lived in his mind. Sometimes he woke in the middle of the night, hearing again the crackle of the weapon, feeling the shock ripple through his muscles. But instead of letting the memory weaken him, he used it to fuel his purpose. He wrote speeches, drafted proposals, and spoke with community leaders, determined to make sure no one else would endure what he had. His family stood by him through it all. His daughter, only a teenager, once looked at him with worried eyes and asked, "Dad, why did this happen to you? You're so important. How could they not see that?" Marcus hugged her gently, choosing his words with care. "Sometimes people see only what they expect to see," he said softly. "They don't stop to ask questions. That's why we must speak up, so that the next time, they will see more clearly." She nodded slowly, her young mind beginning to understand the depth of what her father was facing. The police department eventually released its findings. At a press conference, the chief stood again at the podium, his expression more serious than before. "After a thorough investigation, we have concluded that the officer involved acted in violation of our department's protocols," he said. "His use of force was unjustified. Effective immediately, disciplinary action will be taken, and further legal proceedings are underway." The words carried weight, and though they did not erase what had happened, they marked a step toward accountability. The officer faced charges in court, and the case drew national attention. News channels broadcast every update, showing the young man entering the courthouse, his face downcast. Some people felt anger toward him, while others saw him as a symbol of a broken system that needed repair. Marcus, however, chose a different path. When asked by reporters how he felt about the officer, he replied calmly, "I am not here to seek revenge. I am here to seek change. Punishing one man will not fix the problem. We must fix the culture that allowed this to happen." His words struck a chord with many, reminding them that justice was not only about punishment but also about transformation. Community meetings began to take place across the city. Marcus often attended, standing at the front of crowded halls, speaking with the same calm authority that had guided him in government. He told his story plainly, without anger, but with deep sincerity. "What happened to me could happen to anyone," he said. "But we have the power to change that. We can train our officers better. We can teach respect, patience, and understanding. We can build trust instead of fear." Each time he spoke, people nodded, clapped, and sometimes even wiped tears from their eyes. Lawmakers began to take notice. Bills were drafted proposing new rules for police conduct, including mandatory training in de-escalation and anti-bias awareness. Discussions spread beyond the city to the state and even to Congress, where leaders debated how to ensure fairness across the nation. Marcus met with senators, representatives, and governors, his voice steady as he urged them to act. "This is not about politics," he told them. "This is about humanity. Every citizen deserves to be treated with dignity." In private moments, Marcus often felt the weight of it all pressing on him. He was not just a man recovering from a painful incident, he had become the face of a movement. Some nights, he sat alone in his study, staring at the piles of letters sent to him from strangers. Many were words of encouragement, thanking him for speaking out. Others were heartbreaking stories of people who had faced similar experiences but never received justice. Marcus read each one carefully, his heart heavy but determined. He kept the letters in a box, a reminder of why he could not stop. The officer's trial moved slowly, but each step of it reminded the nation of what had happened. Witnesses testified, videos were shown, and lawyers argued. Marcus attended the hearings quietly, sitting in the back with his hands folded. He did not glare at the officer, nor did he celebrate when the prosecution made strong points. He simply watched, calm and steady, his presence a silent reminder of the truth. When reporters asked him afterward how he felt, he said, "I hope this process teaches us something. Not just about one man's actions, but about the responsibility we all share." Slowly, reforms began to take root. The city announced new training programs, new oversight boards, and new channels for citizens to report misconduct. Some people doubted the changes would last, while others felt hopeful. Marcus knew that real transformation would take time, but he also knew that every step mattered. Even the smallest policy change could save someone from the pain he had endured. One evening, Marcus was invited to speak at a town hall meeting. The room was full, with people standing against the walls and others spilling out into the hallway. As he walked to the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. He raised his hand gently, asking for quiet, and then began to speak. "I stand before you not as a victim," he said, his voice steady. "I stand before you as a man who believes we can do better. Justice is not just about laws. It is about respect. It is about seeing each other as human beings first. And if we can commit to that, then the future will be brighter for all of us." The audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some shouted his name, others cried openly. Marcus smiled faintly, humbled but resolute. He knew his journey was far from over, but he also knew he was not walking it alone. As he left the stage that night, he thought about the road ahead. There would be more challenges, more debates, more resistance. But there would also be more hope, more unity, and more progress. And in that balance, Marcus found the strength to keep going, not just for himself, but for everyone who needed him to stand tall. Months had passed since the day Marcus collapsed on that busy street, but the memory was still alive in people's minds. The incident had started as a shocking moment captured on cell phones, but it had grown into something far larger, a call for fairness, respect, and change. Across the city, new programs were being introduced. Police recruits now went through additional training that focused on communication, patience, and de-escalation. Officers were encouraged to build relationships with the communities they served, not just enforce laws. And for the first time, independent boards of citizens were given the power to review cases of misconduct. For Marcus, the changes were a reminder that pain could be turned into progress. Each time he read the updates, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not for himself but for the people who might be spared from injustice in the future. He often told reporters, reform is not about one man's story. It's about ensuring everyone is treated with dignity, no matter who they are. Those words had been repeated in newspapers, magazines, and television programs across the nation. Yet even as reforms took shape, Marcus knew healing was not easy. The wound inside him was deeper than the shock of the stun gun. It was the knowledge that he had been judged unfairly in the blink of an eye. He remembered the faces in the crowd, the gasps, the disbelief, and his own daughter's worried eyes when she asked why it had happened. These memories stayed with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the work still left to do. One evening, Marcus walked alone through the very street where the incident had taken place. The city was calmer now, the traffic moving as usual, people hurrying home from work, children laughing as they chased each other on the sidewalks. He paused at the spot where he had fallen months earlier. For a moment, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The sounds of that day echoed faintly in his mind, the crackle of the stun gun, the cries of the crowd, but then he opened his eyes and looked forward. This was no longer just a place of pain, it was a place of purpose. As part of his healing, Marcus decided to launch a civic campaign. He called it Equal Justice, Equal Respect. The campaign was not about politics but about people. He traveled to schools, churches, and community centers, telling his story and listening to others. In small towns and big cities, he stood before audiences of every age and background, reminding them that change begins with awareness. He often said, "The greatest power we have is not in titles or positions. It is in how we treat each other every single day." The campaign quickly grew, supported by volunteers who believed in the cause. Posters appeared on street corners, social media accounts spread messages of hope, and people began to share their own stories of unfair treatment. Marcus listened to each one with patience, offering not just words of encouragement but also pathways to seek justice. His calm voice and steady presence inspired many who had once felt invisible. National leaders also took note. Marcus was invited to speak at universities, international conferences, and even at the United Nations. Each time, he carried the same message: fairness is not optional, it is essential. His words touched not just politicians and officials, but ordinary people watching from afar. A teacher in another country wrote to him saying, "Your story reminds me to teach my students that respect has no borders." A mother wrote, "Because of your courage, I finally had the strength to speak up for my son." These messages became treasures to Marcus, fueling his journey forward. At home, Marcus found strength in his family. His daughter grew more confident, inspired by her father's resilience. She often accompanied him to events, sometimes even standing beside him on stage. Once, when asked what she had learned from her father's experience, she answered simply, "I learned that dignity is something no one can take from you, unless you give it away." Her words made Marcus's eyes shine with pride. The officer who had stunned Marcus faced the consequences of his actions. After the trial, he was removed from the force and given mandatory education in community service programs. Many people expected Marcus to celebrate his punishment, but he did not. Instead, he expressed hope that the officer would learn from the experience and grow into someone who could make amends. "Justice is not about destroying someone," Marcus said in an interview. "It's about helping them see the truth and giving them the chance to do better." As the months turned into a year, the memory of the incident did not fade, but it transformed. What had once been a moment of humiliation had become a turning point for an entire city and beyond. Schools began teaching students about respect and fairness in new ways. Police academies invited Marcus to speak to new recruits, so they could hear firsthand the impact of rash decisions. Community leaders across the country reached out to him for guidance. He had become more than an advisor to the president, he had become an advisor to the people. One spring afternoon, Marcus stood on a stage at a large public park. Thousands of people had gathered for a rally celebrating the progress made since his campaign began. The sun was warm, the air filled with hope, and families stood together holding banners of encouragement. When Marcus stepped forward to speak, the crowd erupted in cheers. He waited patiently, his hands folded in front of him, until the noise settled. "My friends," he began, "a year ago, I stood in this city not as a speaker, but as someone who had fallen. That moment could have broken me, but instead, it gave me strength. It gave us all strength. Because out of pain came unity, and out of unity came change. And that change is just the beginning. His words carried across the park, clear and steady, reaching not just ears but hearts. He continued, "What we have proven together is that no voice is too small, no story is too unimportant, and no act of respect is ever wasted. If we continue to see each other with open eyes, open hearts, and open minds, then there is no limit to the fairness we can build." The crowd roared with applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, clapping their small hands. Young people held up signs that read "Equal justice, equal respect," and "Stand tall like Marcus." It was no longer just his story, it was theirs too. That evening, as Marcus returned home, he sat quietly in his study, reflecting. The box of letters still rested on his desk, now overflowing with even more messages from people across the world. He opened one, written in neat handwriting by a high school student. It read, "Because of you, I believe I can be someone who makes a difference." Marcus smiled, folding the letter gently and placing it back in the box. He knew the journey was far from over. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt, and struggles to overcome. But he also knew that the seeds of change had been planted, and they would continue to grow. His own pain had not been wasted, it had been transformed into a legacy of courage, unity, and hope. In the quiet of that night, Marcus looked out his window at the city lights. He thought about the people walking on the streets below, ordinary men and women just like he had once been on that unforgettable day. And he whispered to himself, "Every person deserves to walk without fear, to be seen for who they truly are." His words faded into the silence, but they carried with them the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Marcus had been judged unfairly, but he chose not to be defined by that moment. Instead, he turned it into a movement that changed lives. And as time went on, his name became a symbol not just of resilience, but of the simple truth that respect is the foundation of justice.